So this morning, as we cover Lesson 8, this is going to be all about the modern missions movement. And it really goes back a long ways. We really have to go back almost to the 1700s as we look at the church history. Protestantism, this is right after the Reformation, the 30-Year War, and basically the sorting out of Catholic and Protestant countries in Europe. There was just a lot of people tired of religion, if I could put it that way. Protestantism had become cold and impersonal already by that time. And so there was three movements that are kind of interesting that crop up at this time. One is Quakerism, and the Quakers really believed in a personal relationship. They believed in, they didn't want formal worship. In fact, they would get together in a group, and they would, when somebody, the Spirit moved somebody, they'd begin to speak and teach and pray. And the Quakers were, George Fox was kind of the key name we associate with that movement. And they immigrated to the United States, especially a lot of them gathered together in Pennsylvania, which was given as a colony for the Quakers. The Pietist movement, which really was in Germany, and there's a number of names related to that, but one that's really prominent is Nicholas von Zinzendorf. Zinzendorf was a Moravian, and the Moravians have a long history of very significant evangelism. And then the Methodists really came out partly out of that because it was John Wesley who got saved through his relationship with some of the Moravians. And so these three movements really kind of refired the biblical Christian faith as we would know it. And so as we move on from there, we realized that there was this also an area that we're not going to spend any time with, this enlightenment and scientific revolution that was taking place in the thinking of people. And at that same time, while that was happening, we see a lot of theological liberalism creeping in as well. And so came out of that period many people that identified themselves as deists. And a deist is a person that believes in a creator, but they kind of believe that God created the world and then kind of said, take care of yourself. In fact, Voltaire has this quote that I think really describes what the deists thought. He says, I believe in God, not the God of the mysticism, the mystics, but the God of nature, the great geometrician, the architect of the universe, the prime mover, unalterable, transcendent, everlasting. He says, I shall always be convinced that a watch proves a watchmaker and that a universe proves God. So for him, God was his creator, but not necessarily his savior. And so that was the concept. And you'll realize if you go back to think about some of your American history, that a lot of our founding fathers were influenced by deism and some of these Christian thinking at that time. The Catholic Church, and if we look at evangelism as we begin to think about modern missions, the Catholic Church had, under Pope Gregory the Great, really done a lot of evangelism to the Germanic tribes. We had in the medieval church, they neglected evangelism for the most part for many centuries. And at that same time, you saw the rise of Islam. So they were countering Islam for a lot of that time. And then also you had the Holy Roman Crusades, which did a lot to undermine not only evangelism, but the church's authority itself. And so we get into the Reformation Church, and the Reformation Church was fighting for its survival. It was defining itself and its theology. They were embroiled in a lot of military conflicts, the 30-Year War and so forth, and they were being recognized and then modified to a certain extent by some of the countries that they became a part of. And it was therefore not really devoted much to missions. And so the Reformation was preoccupied, I guess I'd put it that way. And so what we see is coming about here in the roots of the modern mission movement really come out of this time period where the revivals of the 1700s, there were some of those going on, especially because of Pietists and the Quakers. The voyage of discovery and all the colonization that was taking place all over the world. The trading companies, there was a lot of capitalism going on worldwide. A lot of these countries, for instance, in Africa and South America, were settled by the Europeans because they were looking for raw materials. They were also looking for markets for their goods, their finished goods. They were looking for gold and silver and all those things that motivated the explorers. And the Jesuit missionaries, they were very faithful in getting out there, and they really promoted the Catholic tradition throughout the world at that time. And so these are all things that kind of predate what we would call the modern missions movement. And so there were several missionary sending organizations. And one of the things, if you remember back to the Reformation, Martin Luther wasn't the first reformer, was he? We talked about people 100 years before. John Huss, who was martyred 100 years before, he was kind of one of the earliest ones. But there was a whole series of other reformers that came along. It's just that Martin Luther gets a lot of the credit, right? He kind of was the tipping point where the Reformation really became, a movement that became a real, an important thing that everybody took notice of. Well, the same thing's kind of true here. When we look about the modern missions movement, there was a Scottish Society for Propagating the Christian Knowledge. And this organization is still very, very active today. They primarily were involved in printing. You got to stop and think about, again, the printing press was a huge part of the spread of Christianity worldwide. And the reason that there are so many Christians in the world today owes a lot of its numbers to the fact that we had the printing press. And so it's interesting, as I go back and I look at some of these old organizations that developed way back then, in this case in 1698, and what you find is these are organizations that had these long names. And for some reason, we shorten them up sometimes. We like to put acronyms and initials to them now. But the Scottish Society is still very active today in promoting and putting out literature, but they also were some of the earliest sending out missionaries. The Danish kings were really, really instrumental in some of the earliest efforts to send out missionaries. And they had the first mission to India. In fact, Mark Vishvasam with Kingdom's Harvest International, who you heard from 3 weeks ago, he and his wife Irene are staying at our house for a couple of weeks. And we were talking about this last night, and I asked him about it. He says, oh yeah, he says, this organization was the very first in his area of India to translate the Bible into Tamil, the language that is native to him. And so this is 100 years before William Carey, who's going to be kind of a centerpiece in what we're going to be talking about this morning. The Moravian missions are just one of several, but the Moravian missions, and again, Count von Zinzendorf was one of the key people here, began to send out missionaries in 1732. And they were sending missionaries to America, they were sending them across Europe, and to places like India. The organization, though, that kind of, again, like Martin Luther's nailing the 95 Theses on the wall, or on the door of the Wittenberg Church, really kind of tipped things and kind of started this avalanche. That's really true of this organization, Particular Baptist Society for the propagating the gospel among the heathens. Okay, another one of these long names. But this was the organization that William Carey helped found, and he was the very first missionary that they sent out, and they formed in 1792. William Carey, if you don't know who he is, he was really considered the father of modern missions. And the more he read his Bible, and he was a cobbler by training, he fixed shoes. Okay, so he, at his cobbler's bench, as he was fixing shoes, he would read the Bible. And he was a gifted linguist. He taught himself Latin and Greek and all these different languages that to me just would be insurmountable. I was listening to a guy the other day, his name is Ron Cantor, and he and I have exchanged a couple of emails. Ron Cantor grew up in the United States. He went back to Israel, and he's been there for several years, and he said it took him 7 years to learn Hebrew. And he said it was 7 years before he could preach a sermon in Hebrew. He's a completed Jew, and he has a large congregation there. And so, learning a language is not simple. I don't know about you. I started learning Spanish once, and I finally decided, if there was one language I should really learn, it should be English. And so I'm still working on that. And so But he came to the conclusion, the more he studied, the more he was convinced that the peoples of the world need Christ. And he read and he made notes. He made a great leather globe of the world. And he would pray over that as he was working in his shop. And in the quietness of his shop one day, not in some enthusiastic mission conference, he heard a call. He said, he heard this: if it be the duty of all men to believe the gospel, then it be the duty of those who are entrusted with the gospel to endeavor to make it known among all nations. And Carey sobbed out, he says, here am I, send me. And so he made a commitment, not just mentally to ascend to the idea of missions, but he made the commitment to go. And so William Carey is that guy that really was at the tipping point of modern missions movement. And his commitment to world missions was not quickly accepted. In fact, even within this organization that he was a part of, once at a meeting he suggested that a topic for discussion would be the conversion of the heathen. To which one of the ministers responded, young man, sit down. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he will do it without your help or mine. So not everybody, and in fact, when you stop and think about it, you know, we talked about Calvinism, 5-point Calvinism. You know, there are some people that just believe that, hey, people are predestined to be saved or be lost. You know, and it's, you know, we don't need to do anything about it. And so we as evangelicals find that a little disturbing to even to say that out loud. But that's really the attitude of some people within the Christian faith. And so William Carey, let's see, I think I'm getting, here we go. He wrote something, again, with one of those long titles. And it is the inquiry into the obligations of Christians to use means for the conversion of the heathens. It's abbreviated usually when people talk about William Carey's writing, they talk about the inquiry, okay, for obvious reasons. And so he wrote this, and it's not that long. It's like 87 pages long. I've got a copy. You can pull it down. It's wonderful on the internet today. You can pull down all this stuff. But you can read that, and he challenged the members of his society to send out missionaries, to be actively involved in doing that. And so here he was, a shoemaker, became a minister, and really he was the one that created this movement out of this document that he created. So in this inquiries, he laid out 5 specific steps. Number 1, he said, we need to recognize that the Great Commission is a command, and it still exists. In Matthew, it says, what? Go ye therefore into all the world and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And so he reminded them of the Great Commission. Number 2, he charted the history of missionary activity. You can go all the way back through the book of Acts, which we did earlier in our church history, and you can see the missionary activities of people like, you know, Peter and Paul and many of the other disciples. He offered a table. This is kind of practical, and you got to stop and think. He didn't have Google, you know. But he sat down and he actually has charts in there of the peoples groups of the world at that time, the religions that they practiced, and how many unreached people there were. And that had to be a major undertaking in and of itself to come up with those kinds of numbers back in those days. Then in the 4th section, he answers objections. Well, there's going to be some hardship. You know, these are unreached areas. Patty and I, one of the things when we go to India for weeks at a time, we're always really quick to ask, now, is there a nice hotel that's air conditioned? And can we get good food?
I was just going to say, he was my great-grandfather.
Was he really? Oh, that is amazing. That is amazing. Great-grandfather. Wow. I'm going to have to dig into my genealogy some more. But so he answered the questions about the hardship and the language barriers and all those kinds of things. And then number 5, he proposed the establishment of missionary sending organizations. And so he mapped all this out in that book, Inquiries, in that publication. But he became a preacher and he started preaching. And one of the places he preached was at a place called Fair Lane Baptist Church, Baptist Chapel is what it was called. It's north, it's in Nottingham, north of London, about an hour's drive. And on May 30th, 1792, he preached a sermon there that has become known as the Deathless Sermon. I don't know why it has that name. except that he preached from Isaiah 54, 2 and 3. And those verses say, enlarge the place of your tent, stretch your tent curtains wide, do not hold back, lengthen your cords, strengthen your stakes. For you will spread out to the right and to the left, your descendants will dispossess nations and settle in their desolate cities. And that's what he preached on. And it's out of that sermon that his challenging phrase came, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. And that's really what he's known for. He's become the father of the modern missions movement, and here are the 5 things that he really has given. And if you stop and think of what you know of as missions, and I grew up in a church where I'd heard the word missionary, but I'd never seen one. Didn't know if they really existed or not. And I remember the very first time Patty and I went to it's a very memorable weekend, because Patty and I, it was about June 23rd or 24th, we went to Holdridge, Nebraska for a wedding. One of my college classmates from the Holcomb Free Church was getting married, and we went to their church, and we got there a little early, and we see these pictures of missionaries. And so we thought, well, they must exist. They must actually exist. And in fact, it's really interesting, and the reason I can remember the date is because we came back that night to Kearney. We spent the night in Kearney, and we were in our 20s, and so it was not normal to wake up early. It is now, but it wasn't then. Okay, and so we woke up really, really early, and Patty says, well, what are we going to do? She says, should we go visit that church we've been invited to in Lincoln? And we came back to Southview Baptist Church. We got there early, too early. Door was locked yet. And so we went home, read the newspaper, came back. Patty got saved that Sunday. And so it's very memorable from that standpoint. But these were the 5 things that Carey proposed that are still, when you think of it, a part of our modern missions movement today. Number 1, that those missionaries that are sent out should be sent out with the support of individuals and churches. The Christians should be the ones sending and spending to support those missionaries. Number 2, the missionaries are to communicate regularly with those people that send them. And as you heard Mark here 3 weeks ago, when he shared, he probably had a newsletter from Kingdom's Harvest International about the people that were being saved and the churches that are being planted and those kind of things. That's along this same model. Third, the Bible has got to be available in their language. And so translations of the Bible were really a critical part of the missions movement. And number 4, in addition to planting churches, there needed to be efforts to change things socially, to provide education, medical assistance, and those kind of things that we could offer those people that we are ministering to. And number 5, that the gospel message must create social and cultural change. One of the things that the Catholic Church in their evangelical efforts throughout the centuries have been criticized for is blending of local traditions. If you go to South America, Mardi Gras is a great example of it. It's really, it was permission to, basically shed your religion and do whatever you want to for a few days. And so they basically combined a lot of local traditions with Christianity. And so these were really the 5 things that really marked the modern missions movement. And it's one of the key reasons why we consider William Carey the father of the modern missions movement. So why India? Why did he go to India? Because he did. He went to India, he and his wife and his family, and there was a lot of hardships. He was not really supported. And I stopped and think, you could maybe theorize why he went to India. Well, number 1, again, it was a time of the colonization of so many countries, and who ruled India at this time? The British. And so he could get there. In fact, it wasn't easy to get there, though, because the British, the trading companies from Great Britain were not really excited about pastors going there. They really weren't supportive of the missions movement. And so what happened is they got on a ship, he and this fellow by the name of John Thomas, who was a doctor. The 2 of them were the first 2 missionaries sent out by this organization. They got part way on a ship, and then they were kicked off, literally. And they had to wait for another ship that would take them. And so when they got there, even when they got to India, they were not strongly supported by the British. The British kind of were happy to let the caste system and everything that was there work for their benefit, okay? So the British in general were not real evangelical as a group. And so when Carey got there, there was a lot of hardship. And just making a living and taking care of their needs of their family. But he as he looked at the opportunities within the world and looked for the British influences, that's one of the reasons certainly India popped up, but because there was a huge population even back then of unreached people. The particular Baptist Society, though, they agreed to send John Thomas, and they sent William Carey as the first two missionaries. Now, John Thomas was a medical doctor, and it's interesting, it was 7 years before they got their first convert. And it was interesting, this convert they got is a guy by the name of Krishna Paul, and Krishna Paul was the first, and again, 7 years before they saw their first convert. He actually wrote many hymns. He was he became a pastor, was very instrumental in the further growth of the church there. But it was because John Thomas was treating him for a broken arm. He was a carpenter, couldn't work very well with a broken arm. And so it was John Thomas John Thomas doesn't get a lot of credit, but he was the companion, and he wasn't there nearly as long as William Carey. But William Carey was the guy with the ability, the intellect, to be able to translate languages. And he translated all or part of the Bible into 44 different languages. If you're not familiar with your world history very much, you go to India, and it's a lot like China. Multiple different countries that somebody, by forced together into a country that we now see on the map as one big country, but reality is they have hundreds of languages. And so India is the same way. And so William Carey was that guy that figured out how to translate and understood Bengali. Some of these languages, as you've probably heard from people with Wycliffe and other organizations, some of these languages have never been written down. So you first have to define the language, create a written form of it. But this is back in 2016, and Patty and I had the chance while we were in Calcutta, India. We said, hey, we want to see William Carey's church. Well, it's still functioning today. That was really, one of the things that excites me about church history is when I can see churches and organizations still producing fruit today that were planted 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Well, this is the church that William Carey planted. In fact, while we were there was a youth group meeting, and this is Patty and I standing in William Carey's pulpit. That was kind of cool. So I couldn't find that picture of Patty in Martin Luther's pulpit, but here she is in William Carey's. And that church, as you go into the front door, between those pillars, you go in the front door, here is attempt great things for God, expect great things from God. Others followed. There was a lot of there was momentum building within the modern missions movement. Here's an interesting story. Adoniram Judson, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name. Anybody else got a better? It's always an awkward name for me to remember. But Judson, interestingly enough, was he was the first congregational missionary sent out from America to go to India. Well, what happened is kind of interesting. On the way to India, he's studying baptism and he's studying theology, and he decides there is a case for baptism by immersion. And that's what you really should do. And so he adopted Baptist theology on his own. He arrives in India, he comes to meet with William Carey, and Carey baptizes him. And he becomes a convert from congregational to American Baptist. And then Carey goes on to encourage the American Baptists to support him as a missionary in Burma. And he went on to Burma, and there's a long history of his activities in Burma. But it was really, William Carey had a lot to do with that. Another one was David Livingstone. He was sent out by the London Missionary Society, and David Livingstone explored a large amount of Africa, and he's credited with saving just a handful of people, but their ministry has really been fruitful. And so, again, just a lot of momentum building in the modern missions movement. Here's pictures from our trip to India. This is the the sanctuary in that church today. And that's Patty up there standing with our guide. And here is the baptistry, right in the middle of the floor. Here you see a close-up of it. And that's where Judson was baptized, right there. And that to me is exciting. And in fact, they have a chart of all their pastors from Carey to the present. So one of his greatest contributions of William Carey, he would say probably, is the fact that he did away with something called sete. And you see it pronounced or spelled different ways, but what sete was the tradition was when a man would die as a Hindu, and his body was thrown onto a funeral pyre. Usually, if they could get to the Ganges River, the ideal situation for a Hindu would be to have basically a raft built out of wood, and they throw the body on top and they light it on fire, and then they throw his widow alive on top of it. That was the norm in their country. They also had a lot of infant sacrifice, but this was a practice that in 1799, Carey witnessed it for the first time. And as you might expect, it disturbed him deeply. And he campaigned from that point on to eliminate this practice. And the practice really went undisturbed from 1799 to 1828 and gone on for centuries before that. And when Lord William Beckton became the Governor General, he changed that. And on December 4th, 1829, an edict was given, and it was given to Carey, and it happened to be on a Sunday morning. And the message reached him on Sunday morning, and it says, throwing aside his quaint black coat, he exclaimed, "No church for me today. If I delay an hour to translate and publish this, many a widow's life may be sacrificed." The authorities had the translation before evening. So that was one of his major accomplishments. But again, many things, in addition to translating the scriptures into all these different languages, he was the first one to translate a lot of the Sanskrit literature, some of the famous, age-old literature, into English, so that the English knew what they said. Hudson Taylor came along about the same time too, 1832 to 1905, and he was an English missionary in China for 51 years. Hudson Taylor started the China Inland Mission, and at his death, it included 300 mission stations, 125 schools, over 800 missionaries, 125,000 Chinese in all 18 provinces had come to Christ and were working with his ministry. A huge ministry. This is one of the things that I think gets overlooked many, many times in the modern missions movement is the impact of the women involved in the modern missions. And here's a gal that's a great example, Maria Taylor. She was the daughter of one of the very first missionaries who went to China. She was orphaned at age 10. She ended up marrying Hudson Taylor in 1858, and they had 7 children. And she was fluent in one of the Chinese dialects, and so she helped with the translation. They were married for 12 and a half years when at age 33 she died of cholera in 1870. His second wife was another CMI China Inland Mission missionary. She became the second wife, and they had 2 children. She cared for her husband throughout a number of his illnesses. She edited a number of the newsletters that they did, and had a special ministry among the women. And in her later years, she traveled with him, speaking, writing, organizing the work of the mission. And she died in 1904, a year before he did. And so, again, I think we forget. In fact, I'm going to touch on that a little bit later, as I mentioned one of my favorite examples from the modern missions movement, Fredrik Franson. But other organizations formed. If you go back to the history of the modern missions movement, you see all these organizations that have developed all over the world to send missionaries. The CMA, Christian Missionary Alliance, was founded by A.B. Simpson. And of course, we know the CMA churches, but there's a lot of missionaries that were sent out, and he sent out a lot of missionaries during these years. The Evangelical Alliance Mission team, I'm going to come back to that later, was established by Fredrik Franson. And then the African Inland Mission, founded by Peter Cameron Scott in 1895, and then the Wycliffe Bible Translators came along much later in 1942, but again, dedicated to translating the Bible into every language in the world. Fredrik Franson is a guy that I came across in a previous teaching when I was teaching on the church history, and Patty just gets terribly bored whenever I bring up Fredrik Franson because usually it ends up being a lecture. And Fredrik Franson, I was reading through, studying. At the time, we were attending the First Free Church here in Lincoln. And I thought, kind of like I'm going to do in a couple, 3 weeks here, I'm going to be teaching on the history of the Berean Church. I thought, I should get a little more in-depth into, where did the Free Church come from? Well, as I started reading through different things online, I found one document from one of the colleges, one of the Christian colleges up in Minneapolis area, and they said if there was any one person responsible for the Evangelical Free Church of America being formed, it would be Fredrik Franson. And I thought, who's this guy? I've never heard of him before. And Fredrik Franson, interestingly enough, was from Nebraska. He actually came to Nebraska he was born in Sweden, and he immigrated to Estina, Nebraska. Anybody know where Estina is? I didn't. I could not figure out where this. I thought, well, maybe it's a misspelling. Maybe it's Eustis, or I've been around Nebraska a lot, from one end to the other, and I'm still discovering new little towns that I haven't heard of. But Estina is a little bitty town that actually is defunct. It is no more, but it's up close to Meade, Nebraska. In fact, probably 40 miles from here. But he came over here. Interesting story is his folks had been active in what they called the free church movement. What it was after the Reformation, after the 30-year War, you had these countries that said, oh, we're Lutheran. And other countries said, we're Catholic. And what happened was, especially in the Scandinavian countries, they were strong Lutheran strongholds. Well, the Lutheran church, had the attitude, if you were born in Sweden, you're a Lutheran. Just like a friend of mine likes to put it, he says, just because you walk into a barn doesn't make you a cow, but that was their attitude. And they were very, very offended by people who would get together and have a Bible study and read the Bible for themselves. Again, kind of a throwback to what the Catholic Church did, was they kind of controlled the scriptures. And so here were these folks that were getting together in free gatherings, they called them, to study the Word for themselves. And they were strongly criticized by the Lutheran Church. And so when they came to the United States, they wanted to escape that, what they considered religious persecution. And so they determined that they were going to have their home churches, basically, and they were not going to submit themselves to this organization that's going to control them and tell them what they could and couldn't do with the scriptures. So his folks had been, his parents, his mother and stepfather his father had passed away, were a part of this free church movement. So they get up here to Estina, Nebraska. It's actually very close to where Lashara, little bitty town, is up here, close to Meade. And he was not a believer when he came over. In fact, this is another interesting thing I found out when I was researching this. It said that he contracted malaria, and I thought, malaria in Nebraska? Go back to the 1860s, and there was a lot of malaria in Nebraska. And he contracted malaria. In a year-long recovery, he started reading his Bible. Guess what? He got saved. There was a Swedish evangelist coming through, and they were going to a little Baptist church where he'd been baptized up there at Estina, and he actually helped lead music. He was working with the Sunday school program. He helped lead music. Well, this Swedish evangelist really liked what he did, so he took him along with him, and he traveled with him for a year, leading the music at these crusades, going from Scandinavian community to Scandinavian community, all across the Midwest. Well, what happened was, in the process, when he came back, he joined the evangelistic movement there, and you can see up here in Saunders County is where it would be today. In 1875, he got back to Estina, and D.L. Moody had just returned from Great Britain. And if you know anything about the story of D.L. Moody went over to Great Britain, was really not really well known, but over there he kind of became famous. When he came back to Chicago and he planted Moody Church, his work just exploded. Well, Fredrik Franson went to Chicago, and in fact, I've read that he was the first minister ordained by D.L. Moody back here in the United States. And for 4 years, he did 4 years of lay work at Moody to learn the methods that D.L. Moody used. And in 1881, he was invited to go back to Scandinavia. And so that's D.L. Moody, and that's Fredrik Franson. So Franson, the evangelist, he spent 2.5 years 2 years in Sweden, 1.5 years in Norway, 6 months in Denmark. One of the groups that he was very opposed to, as you might imagine, were the Mormons. The Mormons were very, very active at this time. And in fact, at one point, he had one of the Swedish immigrants walked all the way from Utah back to Nebraska to find Franson, because there was a lot of the evangelical Swedes back there that were being inundated with the Mormon religion. And so he went to Utah. He actually preached there. I've never been able to find a copy of it, but he wrote a book called something about the Mormon error or something like that. But it's basically outlining why the Mormon theology is inaccurate. And so anyway, he ended up going, and they say wherever he went in Europe, they said either riots or revival broke out. And he ended up in jail many times. Back in the United States, he evangelized in Minnesota, Nebraska, Colorado, Utah. In 1 month, in particular, he planted 4 churches in Phelps County, Nebraska, and they all still exist today. The Holcomb Free Church that Patty and I went to, that's one of them. And they were all planted in the same month. They all still exist. In fact, one of the most interesting, I've got several books here that I've been able to find. One's called A Flame for God. It's about his story. This is one that comes from the William Carey Library called Fredrik Franson. Here's another one called Fredrik Franson, World Missionary. But here's something that I find kind of interesting. As I go through here, in the appendix. It says, mission societies and church fellowships founded or strongly influenced by Fredrik Franson. There are 14 of them. And the one he's probably best known for is, and the thing that's interesting is they all still exist. Many of them are still sending missionaries today. He died in Colorado at age 56. Somebody had given him the money to be able to travel around the world, because one of the things that Fredrik Franson was criticized for repeatedly was the fact that he would take brand new believers and he'd put them through a training program, and if they felt called to full-time ministry, he'd send them out, including single women. I mean, this was not acceptable at all to a lot of people. And he provided the missionaries for A.B. Simpson and Hudson Taylor. And so somebody provided the money for him to travel around the world and visit some of these missionaries. He got back to Colorado. He was in Colorado Springs. He was filling pulpit at some churches. And they went to wake him up one morning at age 56, never married, and he was gone. And I look at Fredrik Franson, and I think, here's a guy who left no wealth in worldly terms, but think of the account that he's got in heaven. He's recognized as the founder of TEAM, the Evangelical Alliance Mission. He continued to preach, but his desire was to motivate others for cross-cultural missions. Classes were initiated in Chicago, Minneapolis, and Omaha. And soon a formal board of directors came into being on January 17, 1891. The first band of 35 missionaries boarded the train for the West Coast and eventually for China. So let's look at the effects of the Great Century. And really, it's probably more than the Great Century. First of all, salvation and eternal life for millions of people. Most importantly, thousands of local churches planted. Hundreds of educational institutions established. Transformation of cultures. Spread of benefits of modern medicine. Expanded worldwide Bible translations. So where are we at today as a result of the modern missions movement? I mean, we would not have the number of Christians in the world today if it weren't for the modern missions movement. Take a look at this. Today, now these are numbers from 2015. It just came out in a study last year. But today, the Christians make up 31% of the population of the world. Now, when they use the term Christian, they're including everybody under this umbrella that says Christ is Lord. So you're certainly seeing Catholics, and you're seeing a lot of people. They estimate that of this 2.3 billion in Christians, they estimate that somewhere just maybe slightly under 1 million are Bible-believing Christians, so believe in the inspired Word of God. And to me, that's kind of the litmus test that I would personally have. But of those 2.3 billion, that's by far the largest in the world. Muslims make up 1.8. And when you think about how recently Muslim religion got its start, the thing that's interesting is this would not have happened had it not been for the modern missions movement. Because reaching unreached people in the world with the gospel really is what the modern missions movement has resulted in. It's interesting, though, by 2060, it's estimated these numbers are going to change pretty significantly. It's not because evangelism is not taking place, although it's not taking place, I don't believe, in the same way it has, say, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. But I think the big thing is this. It has a lot more to do with the age of our population, fertility, and childbirth. Muslims have 7, 8, 9 kids. And there's very, very little evangelism by Muslims today. Most of its growth through birth. And so when you look at 2060, you're looking at Christians still being the number one religion in the world, projected, but you're looking at Muslims being very, very close at 31.1%. But again, that growth is through birth more than anything else. Now, so again, who should we be evangelizing? Muslims, which is exactly what we heard about last week from Steve Ozenbaugh and from Steve, who am I missing? Genovic. Steve Genovic and Steve Ozenbaugh. They're reaching out to Muslims. And the thing is, Muslims are coming to us. And that's one of the things that it's interesting when you stop and think about the number of internationals we have living, especially just in Lincoln, Nebraska. There are huge numbers that are coming to us. How many of those people leave the shores of the United States without ever being in an American home? And that's where, if we come alongside ministries like Steve and Steve's, that's where we have a real opportunity to reach out and minister to those people, because there's probably no other time in their lives that they'll be as open to the gospel than while they're here within our borders. So, again, by 2060, this shows you a little bit about the makeup. And Christianity would not be the number one religion in the world today if it weren't for the modern religious movement. Questions? I know I've covered a lot of material quick. We've got a couple of minutes. Anybody got any questions? Or I know some of you have been on the mission field. I know the Rices. I know Ken and Karen Glover. Anybody else here that's been on the mission field? We've done a lot of short-term missions. We've never done any, long-term missions, but there's just lots and lots of opportunities for us to reach out. As Mark shared with you, we helped 10 years ago start a ministry called Kingdom's Harvest International. And the way Kingdom's Harvest International got started was that a friend of mine was asked to come to India to preach some crusades. And while he was there, he came back and says, I met some people there who have such a heart for planting churches and sharing the gospel and ministering within India. And his question was, what can we do to help these people? Because you can support a full-time missionary in India. His family can live on $50 a month. For $150 a month, we provide transportation, ongoing training, seminary level training, and oversight by teachers. And so that's, to me, that type of indigenous missionary can be so much more effective than we can. I'll never forget, if you've never had a chance to hear it, there's a really great audio called Born to Reproduce. It's a classic. Born to Reproduce is an audio sermon that you can find. It is preached by Dawson Trotman in, of all places, Lincoln, Nebraska. It was at the anniversary of Back to the Bible at the time. And Dawson Trotman talks about the fact that it's just a natural, that if an organism is healthy, what does it do? It reproduces. I mean, and so that's why the title, Born to Reproduce. But he talks about in there the fact that he happened to be in Lincoln, and one of the things he was doing that week is he was interviewing missionaries who were planning to go out onto the mission field. And he said, I really just had two questions for him. Number one question was, how's your quiet time? How's your walk with God? Number two was, who can you point to today that's walking with Christ because of your influence in their life? And of course, people had all kinds of excuses. Well, I've been doing language study and I've been doing this, that. But the bottom line was, he says, if you can't do that here, what makes you think you can go to a foreign culture and do it there? And so to me, it's a classic. If you haven't had a chance to hear it, you should just Google it sometime. Born to Reproduce by Dawson Trotman. And but it talks about the fact that if we are healthy Christians, we should be making a difference. We should be salt and light in our world, and we should be making a difference. And the modern missions movement was a radical example of that. And it's really why Christians are found throughout the world today. In India, it's really interesting. There is a deep, deep, long generations of Christian heritage there. We get the impression that there's no Christians in India. That's not true by any stretch of the imagination. Thomas, the disciple of Christ, went to the Jews in India and planted 7 churches. He was martyred in Chennai, India. His tomb is there. They have Mount St. Thomas where he was martyred, and you can go to the cave that he lived in Chennai today. And so there's been ministry going on there for many, many centuries. And so we have a lot of misconceptions, I think, about missions in the world. Questions anybody has? Anybody got some input? Dave?
On your recent trip, Jerusalem was making the news with violence going on and such. Did that attack you or your safety at that time?
Not at all. His question was on our recent trip to Israel, and Bob has said that at some point I could maybe give you a little bit of a travel log on that. But it was my 7th trip, Patty's 5th trip to Israel. We have never, in fact, I would never forget the very first trip I took to Israel, which is over 30 years ago now. And I remember Jim Anderson from Grace University was leading the group, and we had a little gathering ahead of that. And one of the individuals going with us on the trip 30 years ago asked that question. I said, well, are we going to be anyplace dangerous? And he says, well, yeah. He says, in order to get there, we have to go through Chicago. And really, that's really true. I have never, in all the time I've spent in Israel, I've never been, it'd be like, even if you went to Chicago today, you'd have to go to North Chicago and you'd have to look for trouble. But the reality of it is, it's very safe. Number one, they know how to keep you safe, and they've never, every agenda I've ever been on. There's certain places I've never been. I've never been to Hebron. Hebron is one of the hot spots in Israel. Jericho, I was at Jericho this last trip, and Jericho is now, and Bethlehem, both. Jericho and Bethlehem are both based on the Oslo Agreement. They are both controlled now by the Palestinians, but they rely on tourist dollars. So they want you to come. And so we went into Jericho, we went into Jerusalem. And so it's they won't take you any place that's not safe. So, yeah.
When you mentioned the Indian custom of seti, where the guy passed away, they threw the woman on the fire. If the woman passed away first, did they throw the guy on the fire?
His question is if they had seti for men, if the wife, no, they just weren't. Again, Christianity elevates. Now this is just my mind, and it's, don't throw stones at me if you don't like this, but the ultimate feminist was Jesus Christ. He elevated the stature of women in history and in the world. Greater than anything else. In the Jewish tradition, we talked about this on our very first lesson. In the Jewish tradition, a rabbi was not allowed to speak to a woman. And that's true in so many cultures today. In India, not India, in the Muslim world, you'll never see, women given any value to speak of. And so, no, good question. Anybody else before we wrap it up? Next week I'll be gone, but the following week I'll be covering the American revivals and some of the more recent things in our church history. And then the following week we'll be wrapping up with our study of Berean Church and where our denomination has its roots.